everyone, and welcome to the Dill Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo, and here we go. This is the final step of our Oscars Death Race 2025. What the Oscars Death Race is, if you haven't been paying attention, is that it is watching every single nominee, not just your feature films, not just the acting awards, but all the animated, international, documentary, and of course, the subject of today's video, the shorts. And what is very exciting about this year in particular is that this is the first time I've actually gotten to go to the cinemas to see the shorts. And I didn't see all the shorts in the cinemas. I only saw the documentaries, but it's really cool to see this like curated playlist play out in one sitting with a bunch of other reactions and responses, because also it's worthy of note that the short film categories are the hardest to predict when it comes to the Oscars. So it's really fun to just kind of sit in a room with people who are a little bit of the older demographic, kind of the Academy's demographic, and see what they respond to, because I think I have a better grasp at what will win these short film awards because I was able to hear responses from so many people. And like I said, I didn't go through all 15 of these in theaters. I only saw 5 of them in theaters. But I did ask them, some people in the lobby, like, what other shorts did you see? Oh, we just came from the animated ones. What did you think? Live action ones. So I was able to get like a good grasp of what people were thinking. And it was really fun to watch these. And I decided, even though I didn't get to see the animated shorts and the live action shorts in the theaters themselves, I did watch them in the order that the shorts TV presentations in the theaters show them in, just to kind of get a vibe for how some of these voters will be seeing the movies if they do decide to go to the theaters to see them rather than watching on their personal Oscar Academy streaming services. Seeing if that affects the way people think about the certain movies, because I think my opinions of these movies were somehow tainted a little bit by the way I saw them and the order in which I saw them in. But let's start first with the animated shorts, because I think of all the shorts this year, the animated shorts were the ones that I was the most underwhelmed by. I think every year there's always some really heavy-hitting, great animated shorts. The last 2 years, a short that I don't really love has won the award. So I already kind of knew coming into this that there may be some animated shorts I wasn't going to vibe with. But for the majority of these shorts, I just was left very underwhelmed. I thought they were really cute premises and some of the animation was really good, but there was only really one that I was like, wow, this actually sold itself. This is the one that I'm like on board with. Whereas the other 4, I was like, yeah, it was fine. It was cute. The animation was good, but for some reason, these animated shorts this year for me fell a little bit flat. But let's start with the first one. I'm going to go in order in how they were presented by Shorts TV. The first one is called Magic Candies. It's about this little boy Ding Dong who finds these little marbles, and then he buys a bag of colorful candies that look like marbles, but then he starts eating them and he starts talking to these different things. Like his couch comes to life and tells him where the remote is and the couch, and he's able to talk to his dog, and he's able to talk to this bubble gum that when it pops, it speaks to him in the deceased voice of his deceased grandmother. It was cute. Again, this is kind of another one where, not another one, this is the first one, but in that example of other films I was talking about where, the premise is cute, the animation's really, really solid. The animation actually kind of reminded me a little bit of Coraline, the way the figures kind of moved and the way the characters spoke and acted. I do honestly think, I've been reading some reviews and some people have said it would have been better if there was no dialogue at all. For this short, I don't necessarily know if that's something I agree with, only because I think some of the merit is the fact that like the couch comes to life and talks to him and the dog talks to him. But I do think, shorts like this, it is just kind of fun to see him take in these whimsical worlds, these whimsical colors, great animation, as I said, but ultimately like the substance for me, the substance of the short, not the substance of the film that's nominated. I'll say that a lot for a lot of these shorts, style and substance. When I'm talking about the substance, I mean like the actual contents of these shorts. I felt like the substance wasn't there for this one. I felt like it was charming, sweet. I had a good time, but also these animated shorts in general run pretty short. They're all short films, but especially short, like under 15 minutes. And I really just didn't think the film really sunk into a specific rhythm or groove. There were just little flashes of little cute scenes here and there, but ultimately the premise alone is cute, but not enough to really leave too much of an impression. But Magic Candies up for Best Animated Short. Next, we have In the Shadow of the Cypress, which is a little bit longer. It's about 20 minutes, but this one is told with no dialogue. And this is where I get a lot of the sentiments of people thinking, well, maybe these shorts, some of them would have been better with no dialogue versus dialogue. But this is one where it's all no dialogue, but I felt like this one could have used a little bit more dialogue. To kind of get some of the metaphors across. It's all visual metaphor. It's about this father and his daughter, and the father is clearly suffering from some PTSD. He feels fragile, he feels broken, and they quite literally materialize that. They personify that in some of the images and the animations, and then there's a beached whale that shows up, and it kind of shows how this father-daughter team kind of handles that while also handling their own emotions. And I'm sure there's a lot that I could probably pick apart and dissect with subsequent watches, but I felt like just at a surface level, I didn't grasp all of this. And that's just my admitting as maybe just someone who's not as literate and able to grasp every single element of the metaphor and the symbolism in this thing. I will admit my fault in that sense. But I also think, like, I don't know, even the stuff that I was able to grasp onto, the metaphors seemed a little obvious. It seemed like stuff I've seen before, like certain images of stuff crumbling and breaking down. These are metaphors I've seen visually done in other mediums to emphasize the same thing. So it's not like all these visual metaphors aided anything new, unless there's stuff I'm just not seeing that I feel like maybe with subsequent viewings I could like dive a little bit deeper into. But this one was probably the one that left me with the least amount of new stuff to think about and ponder. But I think, the animation's solid. I think it's well drawn, well stylized. It's just not necessarily my particular favorite. That one also nominated for Best Animated Film. Again, all these films are going to be underwhelming for me, including the next one, Yuck. I don't think this is a yucky cartoon. I think it's actually very cute, very charming, but that's kind of where it ends for me. It's all about these kids who are looking at these older figures kissing, and they have this like obsession of watching these adults kiss, and they're grossed out by it, but secretly they all kind of want to know what it's like to kiss as well. So it's this whole short about these kids wanting to kiss people and then learning how to kiss each other, and then they kiss each other. I mean, it's very sweet, very charming. I like how the actual personification of the lips, it becomes like this like glittery pink glowing thing that kind of symbolizes that urge and that fire inside of wanting to kiss. But yeah, that's kind of where it starts and ends. I mean, it's charming, it's silly, it's cute, but again, I don't feel like the depth is quite there for this short the way I think it probably could have. But I also think, for kids kissing each other, you don't want to go too deep to where it gets a little weird. It is ultimately for kids, this short, and it's supposed to be a little bit more lighthearted, more silly, more fun. It is in a different language, so I know a lot of people are going quick to predict it because they're like, you know what, it's charming, it's accessible, everyone will love it, it's sweet, everyone laughs at it. But the stat is that for the past, like 10, 15 winners, they've all been in the English language for the animated short, so I'm not going to be quick to predicting it. And after having seen it, despite being the one that most of the people I talked to in the lobby did like the most, this isn't the one that I necessarily think has Academy Award winner, that aura in a way. Like there's some films that I think about, even the ones I don't like the one, the John and Ono one from last year, which I think I actually liked more as like a guilty pleasure, but I could admit it definitely had its flaws last year. That one still had an air about it that I was like, no, this still feels like it could be like an Oscar winning short. Whereas this Yuck, it doesn't feel like that. It feels almost a little too twee, but it is charming. It probably does the best job in using visual symbolism in a way. But I think the next one we're about to talk about is the one bright spot of the bunch, and that is Wander to Wonder, a fun play on words there. I think this one is most intriguing because of its premise. It's about this guy who dies. He is the host of this children's show, these little animated cartoon figures. And it shows that when he dies, the life for these little figurines continues on, and how they start to film these episodes themselves, even though their owner has passed. It's almost as if like Mr. Rogers died and like the little puppets still existed and put on the shows. It almost has like a Toy Story vibe in that sense too. And I think that alone, the premise was such a hook that like I really liked this one from the start. And honestly, I felt like this one was the most short-lived because this is one that I could feel a potential for an elongated feature-length film version of. I really thought that this could have lent itself very nicely to a full feature. And I think honestly for these shorts, a lot of them, they have their beginning, middle, and ends, and then they're in and out. But this is one where I felt like honestly it could have had even more acts, even more scenes to fully flesh it out. And I felt like I was almost deprived because it was so short. It almost felt like a proof of concept to then greenlight as something more feature length. But I just loved how this kind of married the hybrid between live action and animated. I thought the animation itself was very good. The actual little claymated little figures. I really, really enjoyed the humor of it. I liked where it built to, even though it was very short and almost too short-lived. I just think the uniqueness and the style of humor, I think this just hit all the boxes for me. Now, is it a little weird? Maybe, but it is also in English, which is a good thing for the stat for best animated short winners. And I do think this one at least is a big enough and bold enough and memorable enough concept to where people, when they're looking back on it, they're like, the one's kissing, there's the one with the father and his daughter, there's the magic candies. Oh, there's also that really interesting one about those like animated cartoons that come to life when their owner dies. And like, I feel like it's the one that is the most interesting if you're telling other people about the shorts, like, hey, guess what this one was about? This is a really interesting concept. Listen up. And I think that's why this one probably does have the edge. But we're not predicting things right now. I'm just giving my 2 cents just in the moment. what I think might win, and I think this one is far and above the best of the animated shorts. But we did end the five film slate with a film, A Beautiful Men, which is about these guys going for a hair transplant in Turkey, I believe, is the country they're traveling to. This is another one that I think the animation is actually really, really cute. I think the actual figurines, the actual figures of these main characters, they have very distinct looks and very distinct personalities. They feel very familiar. They're not proportional. They have their obscurities, and they have their interesting things that make them unique and stand out. And I think this film is kind of tapping into the themes of that, about how grown men sometimes feel those insecurities about the way they look, the way their shape of their body is, the way they are balding, and this quite literally directly comments on that, the idea of balding and the idea of trying to hold on to your youth and not wanting to age and having that insecurity about aging. But this is one that I feel like the themes you could get in the first minute or two. You're like, okay, I get what the themes are, and then it just keeps going and going, and you're like, all right, this isn't offering a ton of new information for me. And I just felt like this is another one that maybe if it was live action and they really expanded these characters' backstories and their relationships with one another, this could be like a feature-length film. Even if it isn't animated, this is something that you could see like Charlie Kaufman doing. It kind of has a dark, dry sense of a dark humor to it. But for me, I don't know. I didn't find that the actual events of the short really grew the action and the suspense and the excitement as it went along. And not every short has to, but it felt like the place I was at 2 minutes in was the same that I was at the very end. So I was not the biggest fan of this one. So all in all, this short film crop is just pretty weak in my opinion. I think at the bottom, I'm gonna go kind of bottom to top, just because I think they're all kind of tied for the bottom except for the top one. I'm gonna put In the Shadow of the Cypress at the bottom, just because I feel like the metaphors were obvious, and the ones I didn't pick up didn't obviously leave me much to chew on. Then probably Beautiful Men. I just felt like there wasn't enough substance there to match the style. Same as Magic Candies, I guess, at number 3. Again, cute premise, but that's kind of where it ends there. Yuck, same thing. Like, cute premise, cute idea, cute animation. It's silly, it's fun, it's definitely watchable and enjoyable. And then the top one is Wonder to Wonder. I think it's the best marriage of a great concept, great animation, and it actually follows through with its concept in really interesting ways. But all in all, this slate pretty underwhelming. I was pretty upset by the animated shorts this year, but the live action shorts were much more interesting. So let's start it off with the first film that was shown as part of the 5 film slate in theaters, which was The Man Who Could Not Remain Silent. Now, this is a very, very short. This was only 14 minutes long. It's about this guy who's on a train, and these guys stop the train to kind of look at everyone's documentation, and they're basically asking a guy who doesn't have the documentation what his documentation is, asking what his religion is as well, which basically indicates that they're going to execute these people who are not of the same religion as them. It's a lot of research that you have to do kind of off screen to kind of understand exactly what's going on. But the film itself at least translates that this guy's in trouble, and this guy himself doesn't want to be a bystander, but when he wants to speak up, he decides not to. And it shows how we, being negligent, can aid in someone's danger, because we're not speaking up, we're allowing them to be susceptible to danger. But the thing is that another passenger on the train basically stands up and does speak on his behalf, but then he ends up getting brutally hurt, and as we are led to believe, probably killed for speaking up. So it's one of those really interesting morality plays where the guy who wants to speak up doesn't, and he feels the guilt of not speaking up, but then when he sees another guy speak up, he gets punished for it. So it's like one of those lose-lose things. You either don't speak up and you're a coward, or you speak up and you get the penalty of speaking up. And I think that's just a really interesting moral dilemma for only 14 minutes. Obviously, like I said, this requires a little bit of extra knowledge and extra substance that you have to kind of read about to kind of understand the full picture of what it's going for. But even if you're just looking at it as a snapshot in just 14 minutes, I do think it at least kind of gets that point across of cowardice and whether or not to speak up, because that you could put your own self in danger. And that's one of those like endless cycles of lose-lose scenarios. And I thought that was very impactful. It's just one that I think is just so short that when I'm thinking about the other films, like by the time I got to the 5th one, I was like, wait, what was the first one again? Oh yeah, The Man Who Cannot Remain Silent. I really liked that one, but it didn't stick with me as much as I thought it would, especially now that I'm recording this. Like, it's not the one that's at the front of my brain, but it is still very good. Like, I thought it was very well executed for what it was. I think this is another one that could maybe be elongated into a fuller feature film if you add some scenes of backstory. But again, it works very well as a short, just as what it is. I think it works very effectively. Next is Anuja, which is a film about this really, really smart kid working in a sweatshop who gets the chance to attend a school, and then has to make this really very significant decision based on her and her sister. What is she going to do? Is she going to pursue her talents because she's like a math wizard, she's a genius, or is she going to stay and work? Is she going to work for this guy or that guy? I mean, it's a very interesting look into a very specific culture. And what I really liked is at the end of the short, they actually show the kids, the real kids that are the people in the same village, in the same circumstance. They're watching this film because one of their co-stars is in it, or one of their classmates is in it. I thought this was a really interesting idea, and it had really interesting characters and really interesting ambitions. I like the idea of this little kid genius, and she says something, and then the guy looks it up on the calculator, and it's slightly off, and she's like, "Oh, did you count for break time, 15-minute break time?" And he's like, "Wow, you are a math wizard." I love that when like kids prove adults wrong. I love that. The only problem with this film is that I feel like it builds and builds and builds, and then it just ends. Like it's one of those films that just kind of leaves you kind of open and suspended. And I think it's because if they gave the more honest ending, it probably would have been a big downer. But if they went like the kind of happy ending with it, it would have been a little too twee. So I feel like it's one of those things where, instead the happy medium is we just don't show the ending at all. We let you kind of fill it in for your brain as for what is going to happen to these characters. But it felt very unfulfilling. It felt like it was a little emptier. I mean, a short film, yes, it's short, but it still has to have a beginning, a middle, and end. This was the beginning and the middle. We never got the end. And I feel like it's very underwhelming because of that. So Anuja had potential, but I just don't think it fully realized its potential because it never fully committed to where it wanted to go in the end. And the ambiguity, I think, just didn't work for this one. Moving on next, we have I'm Not a Robot. This is about a woman who actually fails a CAPTCHA test, and then she starts questioning herself if she is a robot or not. And then she kind of calls and finds out that she might actually be a robot. And that is such a great inciting incident, such an inciting premise, and such a great idea that I was really on board with. But as the film goes on, it's kind of got this Black Mirror sensibility, kind of this dark humor, also dark sci-fi horror vibe to it. There's something sinister lurking underneath. The problem is, though, they give a lot of answers about 2/3 of the way through, and the third act is her kind of reconciling with the information she's told, to where I was just like, oh, I just saw this in theaters a few weeks ago with Companion. And not to spoil that film, obviously, but enough people have seen it now that I think the central conceit and the central twist is probably known, especially if you saw that second trailer and saw the poster. But Companion dives into very similar themes of this android, or this robot, kind of coming to terms with her identity, but also learning how to rebel against that and fight off the people who are oppressing her. But I think that's done in a very interesting way, in elongated, full-length fashion, and with all these twists and turns, to where this one just feels very trite and very small in comparison. But I think that's okay, because this obviously came first, so I'm not going to just compare this to a feature-length film that does similar things. But I actually thought the ending of this was good. I thought this actually built to a really interesting conclusion. The only thing is, like, I wonder if this film would have been stronger had we had a little bit more ambiguity. It's almost the opposite of Anuja, where I want closure with the Anuja storyline, whereas here maybe it was almost a little too much closure. It gave us a little too much to answer. I almost would have liked this ambiguity of like, wait, is she actually a robot or not? Because I think they kind of let you know what it is, but then that last shot, it makes you question it all over again. So I like this one. I thought this was fun. I thought the dark humor in the first half was stronger than the more horror thriller vibe of the second half. But it is such a short that it's like, it doesn't really make it too much of a detriment that all the humor is packed up in front. I also love the needle drop. Anything Radiohead, I'm a fan of. So I was a big fan of this one. It didn't hit that emotional punch for me, but it was a really cool examination of identity, and it was just a really cool premise. Moving on next, we have Alien or Alien, however you want to pronounce it. It's hard because it's a play on words, but it is about this woman, her husband and her daughter, who go, her husband is getting his final paperwork finalized to get his green card, because they are married, even though he did immigrate to the US when he was younger, and he's finally getting his green card. His daughter is an American citizen, but they are basically lured there to be kind of captured, kidnapped essentially by ICE, which is, the immigration offices who are trying to capture him and basically send him back because he's not documented, even though he's there to get his documentation. He's done all the process right. He's done everything correctly that he needs to do. Yet they lure him in there like a bait on a hook, and basically leave him defenseless. And it's also shown kind of through the woman's perspective, as this wife who's going through it and experiencing it, as someone who literally can't do anything except for try to get the passports real quick to kind of show the cops like, hey, this is the passport. Like, my daughter, she's an American citizen. But everything's mostly told from her perspective, which I think was an interesting choice. I almost would have liked if it was almost a complete 50-50, getting a lot of his perspective too. We do get some of his perspective, but especially the last third of the film is mostly mostly centered on her point of view and her perspective. But it is still interesting nonetheless, because we see this time and time again in our own history where, one party or one half of the couple is an immigrant, but they are married. They are, doing the whole process and getting the paperwork they need for him to become an American citizen. And it's just so frustrating because this is something we see in everyday life. And the sad part is that this was made a year before this election. So it's not like this is anything new. It's just becoming more and more focused on in the news and more intense since this short has come out. It's almost like a warning sign. It's almost like the documentary I watched for the last video, which is No Other Land, where it's like all this stuff happened, and that's before, all hell even broke loose. And I think that's kind of what this short is too. It's kind of like this warning sign that we should have seen coming. And it's only gotten worse since. I think this is a big message picture, but it is also one that is engaging. It's thrilling. It's intense. I mean, the cinematography, it almost feels like a Safdie brothers film because it moves a mile a minute. The shaky cam, but I think it really works. The shaky cam, it's distracting, but purposely so. It's supposed to give you this anxious feeling and this feeling of intensity and trapped sentimentality. And this trapped sentiment of being restrained and not necessarily knowing how to escape it. I just thought this was so harrowing and so good, so engaging. And just for 14 minutes, this is the shortest of the shorts, I believe, in this category, yet it felt like the most whole story, the most fulfilling arc for these characters, and one that left me on a pretty big bummer note, but was still very powerful. And then The Last Ranger, another one that's a pretty big bummer, especially if you're like an animal rights person, because this is about, these endangered rhinos who are being hunted. It's about this little girl who like kind of befriends one of the rangers who's trying to save the rhinos. And she kind of goes on this expedition to like go check on the rhinos. And while they're checking on the rhinos, there's something really terrible that happens, really tragic that happens. I wouldn't spoil it for you, but the end of the short actually was the most intriguing part for me, because it actually brings in some real life footage and actually shows you that some of the footage that you saw earlier in the film is actual real life footage. And it's kind of one of those things that kind of branches out into more documentary territory toward the end, because it's like, yes, this was a reenacted thing. There was a script, there were actors, but in the end, like, this is something that actually happened, and this is actual footage of it, and like, this is still an actual issue, and these rhinos are becoming endangered. Again, it's not a story we've, not heard before. Obviously, saving wildlife is a very important thing, but it's also something that is so important that we've seen a lot of shorts like this. But I think this is done really successfully, showing you that children's point of view. I think the actor who plays the young kid, she is so fantastic in this as well, and all the other actors around. And I just think the use of the camera work, the use of perspective when it's on the kid's perspective, when it's on the ranger's perspective, and then when it's on the shooter, the hunter's perspective, and seeing how their different perspectives kind of approach this singular event, and also just the very difficult images of the rhinos themselves, it really does pack its punch. It really does make its message known, even though I think it's a little extreme. I think it was a little too much, and even though a lot of the actual brutality was done off screen, it's still a lot to watch and a lot to stomach, especially being the last of the 5 they showed. I mean, I figured they would end on maybe Anuja, maybe I'm Not a Robot, end with some levity, but you end on this really, really tough note to stomach. Especially, I watched all these shorts back to back to back, and this was the last of all 15 I watched. This was the final movie I watched for the death race, so to see it, I was like, whoo, like, that's a tough way to end it. But it at least does try to have a happy ending, which I didn't expect from this short. Like, Alien does not end with a happy ending. This one does, at least. So I appreciated that it tried to leave us on some sort of hopeful note at the end. But if we're going to go back and rank them, I definitely think Alien is at the top. It is the best one for me. And then The Man Who Could Not Remain Silent, even though I needed a lot of other context, I still think it was very strong. Then I'm going to put I'm Not a Robot, because I thought the premise was great, even though I did feel like, I'd seen it just a few weeks ago in Companion. And I did find that the tonal shift was interesting, but I did prefer the first half. I did still really enjoy it. And then The Last Ranger, I think it's still solid. It's just not one I'll ever want to revisit again. And then Anuja, only because it felt a little short-lived and shortchanged at the end. But very successful category there. As for who I think is going to win, I just think they tend to go for message pictures. They tend to go for pictures in the English language. And that's Alien. It's one that's in the English language. It's a great message picture. It's topical. It's urgent. It sends a message. That speech is going to send a message. So that's the one I would predict. Obviously, we're not doing predictions, but I'm going to do them anyway, because, you can't wait 12 hours for my actual prediction video. But here we go. Let's move on to the documentary shorts. These are the ones I saw in the theater. So I'm also going to kind of give my experience as to what I heard around me, the responses the audience gave, starting with Instruments of a Beating Heart, which is just so adorable. It's about this little girl who really wants to play the cymbal in her school's performance of Ode to Joy, but because it is this Japanese school system where the teachers are very strict, she has a very tough road getting there, getting the part, getting the audition, passing the audition, but then also practicing and trying to get on the same page as all the other students and having to deal with very difficult teachers. And the reason this was very sweet is because it's all these little kids playing instruments. It's very sweet. The reason it was challenging, though, is because, the teachers, it was like a roller coaster. At times, I was so furious with the teachers because it was almost like I was watching Whiplash, and I'm not taking complete credit for that because so many other people have said it in their reviews that this is like little Whiplash. But as soon as this ended, I went, that was Whiplash for kids. But the teachers are so strict on their kids. They're like, well, you didn't practice enough. Well, if you needed music, then you didn't practice, and you're not as good as these kids, and these kids are all better than you, and you're just maybe not talented and not smart, and all these things that I was like, wow, like these teachers suck. But then at the end, the teachers are like, see, I was hard on you because I knew you could do it. And then they hug, and I'm like, wait, am I supposed to be siding with the teachers? Am I supposed to be against the teachers? And I think that's the hardest part of this documentary for me, is that I didn't necessarily know if this was advocating for this stricter teaching style and trying to show that, hey, if you're strict with your kids and discipline is going to go a long way, it's going to make them better, and this is going to be something she remembers. Or is it supposed to be speaking on trauma and the fact that if you are too hard on your kids, it's going to traumatize them? And yes, you may get a great result, but you have to ease off your kids and let them be kids. But it's also like, at the end, they are perfect and they sound great. So it's like the teacher did a good job with them, but he also did it in means that made this little girl cry. And I think that's what's so interesting about this film, is that there is no real answer. There's no right or wrong here. They're all right, they're all wrong. And I do think it's one of those things where this is more or less a examination of kids in schools, especially in Japan, where they have much stricter school systems. And like, it kind of asks that question of the audience of, what would you do? What type of teacher would you be? Would you be more lenient and maybe accept something that's less than perfect, but if it means being nicer to your kids? Or are you going to be stricter? Are you going to be more demanding to get the perfect product, and then they will feel more fulfilled because they put in the effort and time and practice? And I think it works both ways, and I think that's why this is such an engaging documentary. But I will say, after everything that came after it in the shorts films display, this is the one I forgot about by the end. I was like, oh yeah, the one about the little kids playing instruments, because all the other ones that followed were so heavy. There's one that's not, but the other shorts after it were either so dense or so heavy or long, to where this one is the one by the end of it. I was like, yeah, that's right, I did watch that one. But hearing the other kids around me, they all thought it was adorable, but I do think a lot of them were like, yeah, I mean, that just doesn't stack up to the rest, because it's the least intense of all of them. It has the least, heartbreaking moments. Even though it is heartbreaking seeing this girl cry, it is the most uplifting, it is the most hopeful, it is the most silly and fun and cute of all the nominees. So I think that's kind of why, being here at the first of these five, it made it harder at the end of the day for the audience leaving the theater to really reminisce on this one as much as the other four. But the next one that followed, I mean, this is the biggest 180 I've ever had in a cinema, where we went from Instruments of a Beating Heart, these cute little kids playing cymbals and drums and bells and singing out loud, oh, to joy, to then this man being killed outside of his barber shop in Incident. I mean, this is a very harrowing story about a guy who's murdered in plain sight out in the middle of the street after leaving work. He is defenseless. I mean, he has a gun on him, but he never pulls it out of his holster. And it's all about how the police not only murder this guy, but then they continue to try to cover it up. They flee the scene, some of them, and then they have to try to like make their story for their bosses and be like, no, he attacked us, he did this, he did that. Meanwhile, we see all the evidence, we see all the body cam footage, we see the street view footage. And what I liked about this is that it wasn't very intricate in its cinematography. It was just the actual evidence that they are able to collect. But I think it also is a good advocate for having that evidence. The reason why we should have body cams, they should not be able to turn them off, because you never know what corruption is going on when they think they're not being watched. And I think it's something that will obviously put a lot of distrust into the criminal justice system and in the people that we are supposed to have protecting us. It's one that is going to infuriate you, but it hopefully will also stir a little bit of hope, because we also see protests start to emerge. This is one of the best edited movies I've seen across all 50 nominees. Like, I texted one of my friends and I was like, no, this is like in my top 5 of all 50 films I've watched for the death race, because it's so powerful and it really lingers with you, and it shows that you can do so much with so little. I mean, these are just very basic stagnant shots of the road, shots from the body cams, and then they edit them together in such a way that there are sometimes simultaneously 4 quadrants, 4 things going on at screen at once, yet the way you're able to navigate the frame and figure out the places to to look and the places to watch and where you should be paying attention to on the screen. It does a really good job aiding the visual viewer in this thing, because it could get overwhelming being like, okay, wait, what am I supposed to focus on? But this film is so good about commanding your focus and making sure you're focusing on the right things at the right times, making sure you're picking up on the details, not making you feel stupid either, being just able to just show a close-up shot, and then you're able to infer for yourself, oh, okay, his gun was in the holster, he never pulled his gun out, like things like that that are just so pleasing as a film fan to watch. You know, you take any footage and you can make something brilliant out of it. You can make something artful and artistic, but also send an important message. This is the most important message film I've seen of any documentary ever. In this short film category. It's just so urgent and so important and so vital now more than ever, and it pisses me off and infuriates me, but it empowers me, and this film is just brilliant. It's so good. It's not an easy watch, and that's why I don't think it's gonna win, because I just don't see the Academy, I could see them turning it off after a minute, because also the first few minutes are all in silence because it's merely the shot of the street. There's no sound until they turn their camera or their microphones on. So it's one of those things that I could see the Academy either turning off after a few minutes or being like, that was a little too much, or I need to watch something as a palate cleanser. I don't feel comfortable voting for that because I don't want to think about that. It's so sad. I think it should win. I think it should win over 15 other shorts across all three shorts categories. If there was only one short film and not split up into documentary, animated, live action, this should still be the winner. But who am I to judge? I'm not an Academy member. But moving on, next we have another heavy one, which is I Am Ready, Warden, which played very lightly compared to what we just saw in Incident. This is one of those things where on its own it would probably be a lot heavier than it was in context with these other shorts, because this is ultimately a hopeful story, even though it's very sad and very hopeless at times. It shows this guy who's on death row, who's basically being executed and has tried to appeal and has not been successful. And it not only shows his perspective as someone who feels like he has changed and is trying to speak out against the death penalty, but it also shows the perspective of the other guy that's father was killed by this guy and his response to it and his own kind of moral dilemmas about the death penalty, being someone who is so urgent and so in need of justice and needing to see this man killed, but also reckoning with, is that how you get justice in these days? Is justice killing someone? Because at the end of the day, execution is murder, and I think that's what's so fascinating about this film, is it brings all those really interesting conversations about the death penalty to light. Now, I know a lot of other films cover this ground, but it's still an issue that's still happening. Until the death penalty is abolished everywhere, then stories like this need to be continued to be told. And I think that's why this is important, and especially because you're getting this full perspective. You're not just hearing from the guy on death row, you're hearing from the guy whose dad was murdered, you're hearing from the son of the guy in jail, and I think it was a little exploitative at times, the fact that there was a shot of the kid literally having his final phone call with his dad on his bed. I think that was something that I was like, I feel a little emotionally manipulated right now, and I don't know if this should necessarily be making the film. This is something that feels like it should be in private, but sometimes with such urgent matters, the urgency of a documentarian is to get something that is usually brushed under the rug or kept in private, and bringing it to a more visible light, to make a point and to make a statement and to make a firm argument against or for something. So I did think it ultimately got its message across, obviously, that the death penalty is wrong. Even though someone can commit the most heinous crime, there are better ways to teach them a lesson, even if that is being in jail forever. I mean, that guy, he literally said, like, I did it and I deserve to be in jail forever. I just don't deserve to die because of it. I don't want to, all this growth that I've been doing and coming to religion and all these things should not be for nothing. But I do think it's a very interesting, nuanced conversation, and this film at least explores that. I think because of that altering perspective of someone who's like, no, I want justice. And both sides are reasonable in their thinking. Obviously I do side with, no death penalty over death penalty, obviously, but it's also like, I understand why the other guy feels the way he does. And even after all is said and done, even he has doubts. And I think that's what's really important about this film, is getting every single perspective you can and not just focusing it on one single perspective. Like this short from last year, I forget the name of it, but it was like the one about all the senses and the guy who was on death row. It was an animated one, but that was one singular perspective. Whereas here you're getting an ulterior, you're getting so many different, a plethora of different perspectives, including a woman who's not even related, but was kind of appointed as this godmother who helped him through in seeing the light of God. But I just thought this was very interesting, very urgent, again, spreading a very important message. But because it had that kind of hopefulness that like people can do better if you just give them a chance, like it did play a lot more positively than Incident. But I think watching this on its own, like this probably would have been a lot heavier and a lot harder to watch. But I think just in the subsequent watching of Incident and then this, I mean, I think the audience around me kind of breathed a sigh of relief, even though this is about the death penalty. This is about some really like harsh stuff. So I just thought it was a very interesting way to program. You have these cute little kids playing instruments, and then boom, Incident, and then boom, death penalty. And then they were able to alleviate it a little bit better with the next short we'll be talking about, which is The Only Girl in the Orchestra. This is one that is not really a message picture. It's more of a an ode to a really cool aunt. And as someone who has a really cool Aunt Rochelle and had a really cool Aunt Kim, they are such guiding lights for me. I love the fact that Molly O'Brien was able to make this documentary about her cool aunt, Oren O'Brien, who is actually the daughter of the famous actor George O'Brien, who I gave my award to in Picture This for Best Actor for Sunrise. So it was a really cool kind of like full circle moment for me. I was like, wow, this is like the daughter of a legend, but she's a legend in and of herself. The film follows her as the only girl in the orchestra. She is the first woman to play in the New York Philharmonic. She plays the double bass too, which is this huge instrument that, like, if you're going to be a badass, a trailblazer woman in the field, like, yeah, you're going to command the biggest and coolest and heaviest instrument, of course, because you're trying to show everyone up and show that you are there to stay. You were there to be a trailblazer. You were there to make an impact. And that's what this film is. It shows her impact. And I think even Oren O'Brien would agree she's not the most interesting subject of the documentary. And I think that adds actually a really cool perspective because she doesn't want the spotlight. She's just happy. The movie doesn't even dive into all the things that she overcame to be the first woman in this orchestra that you would expect a movie like this to be. Instead, it's just about how she's a really cool lady and how she just has really cool experiences. She really cares about her instruments and the people that she is passing the torch to in these younger generations. It deals a lot with their teaching, deals a lot with this instrument preservation in a similar way that last year's winner, The Last Repair Shop, also delved into, which I think is also why this one could very well win. Honestly, I was still moved to tears because not only is this a beautiful tribute from a niece to her aunt, but it is also a beautiful tribute to musicians and what they go through and how they preserve their instruments. There was a scene where she was moving and they were like taking apart the piano to move it to her new apartment. And it was heartbreaking because she's watching this beautiful instrument being kind of teared apart, which obviously is because they're moving and they're going to build it back together. But just the image of the empty, vacant space where all those instruments used to live, I mean, that touched me as someone who's a musician and someone who grew up playing instruments, but also singing in choir and performing. I performed at Carnegie Hall, so like certain things stuck to me, like certain nostalgic memories came to me and made me really honored to do what I do in the music field and the musical theater realm, and this reminded me of that, why we should always take pride in our works, even though it never gets that emotional depth that the other shorts, even the Instruments of a Beating Heart, does. I still think because this is just such a great topic, and I just love the music atmosphere, I love the concert hall aesthetic and just the sound of the double bass. There's so many great musical performances in this thing. I really like this one. Again, this not every short has to be about a message. It doesn't have to be this like big, heavy hitting, heavy handed thing. And this is an example of one that does a really great job. It's also on Netflix, so go check it out. It's really great. Next and last, we have Death by Numbers, and I wanted to save this for last because it was the last one I saw on the documentary short day, but also this is the one that was impossible to track down. A lot of these films were on Vimeo, a lot of these films were on YouTube, a lot of them you could buy, you could rent. This is the one that everyone on the Oscars Death Race Reddit was having trouble with, to where I think there was like a bootlegged cam version that surfaced somewhere. But I was like, you know what? I'm going to go to the theater. I'm going to see it. And I'm going to say, hey, I saw Death by Numbers. I didn't, this is not an incomplete race this year. And I was very fulfilled. But it is a very heavy one. I mean, it's another one that deals with heavy subject matters. It's a survivor of a school shooting, the Parkland school shooting in Florida. And it's about how she kind of gives this really empowering speech to the killer, because the whole trial is about whether or not this school shooter should get the death penalty or not. It's actually dealing with very similar themes of I Am Ready, Warden. But I think what's interesting about this film is it's not just talking about the death penalty. It's also talking about school violence. It's also talking about gun control and gun laws. It's also talking about school shootings. Like, I think it's tackling a lot more interesting thematic stuff than just the death penalty. And even though the death penalty in this one is not as explored from all different angles, like we never hear the shooter's perspective, I think this takes an interesting approach because it turns into something where it's like, okay, whether or not it's true justice to have the death penalty or not, because you're not having the death penalty, this is how we find justice another way. And her way of justice is to let him know that if she has to live with this trauma her whole life, so does he, and she lets him hear it. And I think the best catharsis in this short and across all 5 shorts was hearing her just stick it to that guy and say, listen, you're not going to die for this. Instead, you're going to live with this regret. You're going to live and remember this every single day as a way to haunt you in your dreams, and make sure you never forget what you did. And I thought that was a really cool way of like kind of getting justice in a very unconventional means. It's not just about killing the guy who killed all these kids. It's more so making sure he lives with that regret every single day of his life. And even if he doesn't have regret, he at least doesn't forget what he did, and he at least has to live with those haunted images. But at the same time, I do feel like because it was so much about the process and the trial, I feel like there was honestly a lot of her own perspective that I was almost lacking in this film. I wish we had heard even more from her perspective and her trauma, because she's really resilient and really strong, and that's really admirable. But it's also like, I felt like we still could have gotten a little bit more of her voice in the short, because it was so much about the process, the legal happenings, the court case. Was she going to testify or not? Not more so than like her actual genuine testimony. The very ending tackles that, which is very important. And I think that's the best part of the short, is when they finally get into that stuff. But I thought, the shorts, all in all, the documentary shorts are really solid. I thought this was the best crop altogether. I don't think there was a bad short. At number 5, I would probably put Instruments of a Beating Heart, only because, yes, it was cute, but it was the one I probably remembered the least. And then I would put probably Death by Numbers, even though I do think the ending of it was more solid than I'm Ready Warden. I'm Ready Warden would be my number 3, only because I think it tackles the death penalty from more perspectives and more angles, and has just a more thorough investigation of that. And then number 2, I'll put in The Only Girl in the Orchestra. I just love pieces about instruments and about instrumentalists and musicians, and I thought it was a really cool subject matter. Also, just being this really cool passion piece about her aunt, like I didn't feel like this was trying too hard to get emotional feels out of you, which I actually kind of thought was refreshing and very inspiring all at the same time. And then number 1 is Incident. This is my favorite short of all the 15 shorts. This is the one that I think should win. It's probably going to be The Only Girl in the Orchestra, because it is a little bit lighter, but it also still feels important. It's this trailblazer in her craft. But I think if there is going to be like a message picture to win, it'll probably be I Am Ready Warden, just because also if you look at those like titles, it's a very interesting title. I Am Ready Warden, because it's the end of what his final statement was and stuff. I don't know. I'm reading into it too much. My final Oscar predictions will be coming out tomorrow, but thank you for being along for this journey. Let's cross these films off the list. Let's cross off, boom, boom, boom. There we go. Every single film, all 50, are crossed off the list. We've done it. Finally, a second year in a row, we have conquered it. We have watched every single nominee at this year's Oscars. And because I've seen every single nominee at this year's Oscars, I now not only get to predict the Oscars, but now have the tough task of having to separate my own opinion from it, which is always more difficult. I liked when I could just predict the shorts, having not seen any of them, and been like, oh, this is the one the Gold Derby's predicting. I'll predict it. But now I actually have to dive into my emotional feelings and try to figure out, do I let those weigh into what I was predicting and what I wanted to feel or not? Kind of judging based on the audiences, leaving the theaters. They really, really, really liked I Am Ready Warden and Death by Numbers. I think they really resonated with those themes, but they also love The Only Girl in the Orchestra. It seems like the later films in the slates are the ones that the film, the audiences received better, just because they were fresher on their minds. But all in all, really cool to just kind of go and see all the movies for the first time in the theater. I've never done that before. I hope to do that again next year, maybe for all 15. But this is really fun. I love the short films, especially because they're the ones that don't get all the spotlight. So I like that I'm able to make this video and spotlight them all on their own. But thank you for watching. If you've seen all 15 shorts, let me know how you'd rank them below in their own respective categories. If you've seen all 50 movies, let me know how you'd rank them in the comments below. What movies did you not get around to? Which ones are you now going to get around to having watched this video? And what are your final Oscar predictions? I'm going to be filming mine later, but you can let me know yours now. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Stay tuned for more, and take care.